I'd like to welcome you to the fourth annual Security Science Lecture. You'll be aware, particularly reading the screen behind me, that this lecture is named in honor of Vincent Briscoe, who was an Imperial scientist, professor of inorganic chemistry, here between 1932 and 1955. He's credited with being the first scientific advisor for the security service, what we now call MI5. He worked with them during the First World War, concentrating on secret German writing, but then continued to work in the service of scientific advice, in the service, giving scientific advice throughout the interwar years, and also during and after the Second World War. And we're very pleased that we were able to use his name and honor it in this way by giving the name to our annual lecture. This is, as I said at the beginning, the fourth of our annual lectures. When I introduced the last lecture, the big piece of news was that Imperial had just been recognized as an academic center of excellence for cybersecurity research. And we've been able to build on that over the last year. And we've seen quite a rapid expansion of the Institute here at Imperial. I'm pleased to say we now have almost 50 academics affiliated with the Institute from across the college, spanning the whole range of interests that the Institute has. We've been particularly active in the cybersecurity area. The government's launched a number of research initiatives in this area over the last year. And I'm very pleased to report that the college has been successful in all of the initiatives. And this includes, in particular, the hosting of a new National Research Institute in automated program analysis and verification. More relevant to tonight's lecture, we've also built some external collaborations, and I'm pleased to say we built a very nice collaboration with the University of St Andrews. And over the summer, late summer, we held a very successful workshop in Oxford, which was looking at the topic of terrorist use of technology, so very pertinent to tonight. I'm sure Bruce will comment on this, but some of the key findings that came out of that workshop are really three. The first of which is that terrorists are pragmatists, and simple innovations often matter more than the complicated. They adopt something that we call frugal ingenuity in the face of significant defenses and highly sophisticated countermeasures. The second key finding was that bombs and bullets will remain the method of choice. It's the theatre of a very physical attack that strikes fear and wins converts to the terrorist cause. More esoteric modes of attack are simply too prone to error and detection. Thirdly, having said all of that, the ubiquity and sheer availability of high technology to the non-specialist means that we would be foolhardy not to consider the many threats that might arise in the near future. And there are obvious examples of things like additive manufacturing or 3D printing of weapons, garage biology that is one of the popularizations of the movement into synthetic biology and so on that we've seen recently. Enough on that. Let me now turn to tonight's speaker. Bruce Hoffman is the director of the Center for Security Studies and director of Security Studies program at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. He's a specialist in the study of terrorism and counterterrorism and insurgency and counterinsurgency. And he's been studying these subjects for a very long time. He started as a graduate student at Oxford University from 1976 to 86, where he obtained the B.Phil in International Relations in 1978 and a D.Phil in International Relations in 1986. In 81, he joined the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica, California, and left RAND for the first time in 94, when he was appointed as a senior lecturer and subsequently reader in international relations at the University of St Andrews. He was both the co-founder and the first director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at St Andrews, and also chairman of the Department of International Relations. He left there in 1998 to return to RAND as director of the Washington, D.C. office. During this time, he was also vice president for external affairs and acting director of the Center for Middle East Public Policy. He held the RAND corporate chair in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. He was scholar in residence for counterterrorism at the Central Intelligence Agency between 2004 and 2006, and an advisor on counterterrorism to the Office of National Security Affairs in the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad in 2004, and from 2004 to 2005, an advisor on counterinsurgency to the Strategy Plans Analysis, an analysis office at Multinational Forces Iraq headquarters in Baghdad. Professor Hoffman was also an advisor to the Iraq study group. In November 1994, the director of the Central Intelligence awarded Professor Hoffman the United States Intelligence Community SEAL Medallion, the highest level of commendation given to a non-government employee. Bruce has written widely on terrorism and insurgency. His book, Inside Terrorism, is highly acclaimed and has been revised and reissued since its first publication. Has multiple stars on Amazon from its many readers, so highly recommended. And I'm delighted that Bruce accepted our invitation to give tonight's lecture, so please join me in welcoming Bruce to Imperial, as I now invite him to give his lecture entitled "The Sophistication is in the Simplicity, Modern Terrorism's Technological Trajectory."
Thank you very much, Professor Hankin, for that very kind introduction. Indeed, for summarizing my lecture with the 3 points that were illuminated at the Oxford session in September. Pretty much encapsulates what I'm going to present tonight. Let me also thank the president and rector, the provost, and the faculty and students of Imperial College, and all of you as well for coming. And especially for inviting me to present the 4th annual Vincent Briscoe Lecture. Having read Professor Chris Andrews' Magisterial Defense of the Realm, I actually knew who Professor Briscoe was, so it's a special pleasure and honor for me to be here this evening. Not least to be speaking in front of one of the most important, or 2 of the most important mentors in my life, Professor Andrew, who has long been a friend and a guide, and also Sir David Vaness, at least in my view, perhaps the greatest police officer we've seen in recent decades. Now, I hope I don't wear out my welcome this evening as soon as I start, because in the first part of the presentation, I'll utter 3 words that, at least in some assemblages, are calculated to empty the room of its occupants, and this is Bush, Cheney, and WMD. But these 3 words, I think, are absolutely essential to understanding, really, the 2 different parts of my presentation. One, which will talk about the high end of the technological spectrum, potential terrorist use of weapons of mass destruction. In fact, I prefer to use CBRN, or chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons, but in rehearsing this, that sounds a bit sort of one trips over that easily, so I'm just going to use WMD. I'm not a scientist, not quite a historian either, or a political scientist. I'm somewhere in the middle, but I know the difference between weapons of mass destruction and weapons of mass disruption and contagions. But just for ease and fluidity of presentation, I'll use the term WMD, sullied though it is. And then in the second part of the presentation, I want to explain the paradox of how terrorists really function on both ends of this technological spectrum, and that's really the title of the presentation, where the simplicity is found in the sophistication. Also, I'm going to give, at least in the beginning, what may seem to you a very U.S.-centric view, but that's not my goal. Rather, I want to use a famous commission, or at least in the United States, a famous commission, as a jumping-off point to explore these 2 dimensions of terrorism. Also, unlike many Americans, I've basically weaned myself away from PowerPoints. I hope that's to the better. For so august an occasion of this, I prefer to read. Hopefully I'll have the sort of verve and charisma that will keep you listening, but I apologize if my Bronx accent is the only compelling thing that you hear. Among the most prescient analyses of the likely terrorist threats that the United States would face in the 21st century was the report published in September 1999 by the Commission on National Security 21st Century, better known as the Hart-Rudman Commission, in reference to its two co-chairs, former Senators Gary Hart and Warren Rudman. Evocatively titled New World Coming, it correctly predicted that mass casualty terrorism would emerge as one of America's preeminent security concerns in the next century. So don't forget, this was published in September 1999. Already, the report's first page lamented the traditional functions of law, police work, and military power have begun to blur before our eyes as new threats arise. And notable among these new threats is the prospect of an attack on U.S. cities by independent or state-supported terrorists using weapons of mass destruction. Although hijacked commercial aircraft deliberately flown into high-rises were not the weapons of mass destruction that the Commission had in mind, the catastrophic effects that this tactic achieved, obliterating New York City's World Trade Center, slicing through several of the Pentagon's concentric rings, and killing nearly 3,000 persons, indisputably captured the gist of that prophetic assertion. The report was also remarkably accurate and anticipating the terrorist organizational structures that would come to dominate the first dozen or so years of the new century. Future terrorists will probably be even less hierarchically organized and yet better networked than they are today. This is writing in 1999. Their diffuse nature will make them more anonymous, yet their ability to coordinate mass effects on a global basis will increase, the Commission had argued. And its vision of the motivations that would animate and subsequently fuel this violence were similarly revelatory. The growing resentment against Western culture and values in some parts of the world, as well as the fact that others often perceive the United States as exercising its power with arrogance and self-absorption, the report asserted, was already breeding a backlash that would both continue and likely evolve into new and more insidious forms. Some of the Commission's other visionary conclusions read like a retrospective summary of the past decade. The United States will be called upon frequently to intervene militarily in a time of uncertain alliances, reads one. While another disconsolately warns that even excellent intelligence will not prevent all surprises. Today's tragic events in Syria were also anticipated by the statement in the report that addressed the growing likelihood of foreign crises replete with atrocities and the deliberate terrorizing of civilian populations. Fortunately, the report's most breathless prediction concerning terrorist use of weapons of mass destruction, or WMD, has not come to pass. But this is not for want of terrorists trying to obtain such capabilities. Indeed, prior to the October 2001 US-led invasion of Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda had embarked upon an ambitious quest both to acquire and develop an array of such weapons that, had it been successful, would have altered to an unimaginable extent our most basic conceptions about national security and rendered moot debates over whether terrorism posed a potentially existential threat or not. So let me move to the first part of the presentation, dodging the Wmd Bullet. The terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001 completely recast global perceptions of threat and vulnerability. Long-standing assumptions that terrorists were more interested in publicity than in killing were dramatically swept aside that morning in the rising crescendo of death and destruction. The butcher's bill that morning was without parallel in the annals of modern terrorism. Throughout the entirety of the 20th century, no more than 14 terrorist incidents had killed more than 100 persons. And until September 11, 2001, no terrorist operation had ever killed more than 500 persons in a single go. Viewed from another perspective, more than twice as many Americans perished within those excruciating 102 minutes than had been killed by terrorists since 1968. the year widely accepted as marking the advent of modern international terrorism. So massive and consequential a terrorist onslaught naturally gave rise to fears that a profound threshold in terrorist constraint and lethality had been crossed. Renewed fears and concerns were in turn generated that terrorists would now embrace an array of deadly non-conventional weapons in order to inflict even greater levels of death and destruction than had occurred that day. Attention focused specifically on terrorist use of WMD, and the so-called Cheney Doctrine emerged to shape America's national security strategy. The doctrine derived from Vice President Dick Cheney's reported statement that if there's a 1% chance that Pakistani scientists are helping al-Qaeda build or develop a nuclear weapon, then we have to treat it as a certainty in terms of our response. What the 1% doctrine meant in practice, according to one observer, was that even if there's just a 1% chance of the unimaginable coming due, act as if it's a certainty. Countering the threat of non-conventional weapons proliferation thus became one of the central pillars of the Bush administration's time in office, whether by rogue states arrayed in an access of evil, or by terrorists who might acquire such weapons from those same states or otherwise develop them on their own. In the case of al-Qaeda, at least, these fears were more than amply justified. That group's interest in acquiring a nuclear weapon reportedly commenced as long ago as 1992, a mere 4 years after its creation. An attempt by an al-Qaeda agent to purchase uranium from South Africa was made either late the following year or early in 1994 without success. Bin Laden's efforts to obtain strategic nuclear material nonetheless continued, as evidenced by the arrest in Germany 4 years later of a trusted senior aide named Wmd Mahmoud Salim while attempting to purchase enriched uranium. And in May 1998, the al-Qaeda leader issued a proclamation in the name of the International Islamic Front for Fighting the Jews and Crusaders. Titled The Nuclear Bomb of Islam, the proclamation declared that it is the duty of Muslims to prepare as much force as possible to terrorize the enemies of God. When asked several months later by a Pakistani journalist whether al-Qaeda was in a position to develop chemical weapons and try to purchase nuclear material for weapons, bin Laden replied, "In answer, I would say that acquiring weapons for the defense of Muslims is a religious duty." Bin Laden's continued interest in nuclear weaponry was also on display at the time of the September 11th attacks. Two Pakistani nuclear scientists named Sultan Bashir Ruddin Mahmoud and Abdul Majid spent 3 days that August at a secret al-Qaeda facility outside of Kabul. Although their discussions with bin Laden, his deputy Ayman al-Zawahiri, and other senior al-Qaeda leaders also focused on the development and employment of chemical and biological weapons, Mahmoud, the former director for nuclear power at Pakistan's Atomic Energy Commission, claimed that bin Laden's foremost interest was in the development of a nuclear bomb. The movement's efforts in the biological warfare realm were, however, far more advanced and appear to have begun in earnest with a memo written by al-Zawahiri on April 15, 1999, to Mohammed Atef, then deputy commander of al-Qaeda's military committee, citing articles published in Science, the Journal of Immunology, and the New England Journal of Medicine, as well as information gleaned from authoritative books such as Tomorrow's Weapons, Peace or Pestilence, and Chemical Warfare. Zawahiri outlined in detail his thoughts on the priority now to be given to developing a biological weapons capability. One of the specialists recruited for this purpose was a US-trained Malaysian microbiologist named Yazid Sufat. A former captain in the Malaysian Army, Sufat graduated from the California State University in 1987 with a degree in biological sciences. He later joined Jamaah Islamiyah, the Islamic group, an al-Qaeda affiliate operating in Southeast Asia, and worked closely with its military operations chief, Ridwan Isamuddin, better known as Hambali, and with Hambali's own al-Qaeda handler, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the infamous KSM, architect of the September 11th attacks. In January 2000, Sufat had played host to two of the September 11th hijackers, Khalid Al-Midar and Nawaf Al-Hazmi, who stayed in his Kuala Lumpur condominium. Later that year, Zacharias Moussaoui, the alleged 20th hijacker, who was sentenced in 2006 to life imprisonment by a federal district court in Alexandria, Virginia, stayed with Sufat too. Under KSM's direction, Hambali and Sufat set up shop at an al-Qaeda camp in Kandahar, Afghanistan, where their efforts focused on the weaponization of anthrax. Although the two made some progress, biowarfare experts believe that on the eve of September 11th, al-Qaeda was still at least 2 to 3 years away from producing a sufficient quantity of anthrax to use as a weapon. Meanwhile, a separate team of al-Qaeda operatives was engaged in a parallel research and development project to produce ricin and chemical warfare agents at the movement's Durunta camp near the eastern Afghan city of Jalalabad. As one senior U.S. intelligence official explained, al-Qaeda's WMD efforts weren't part of a single program, but rather multiple compartmentalized projects involving multiple scientists in multiple locations. The Durunta facility reportedly included laboratories and a school that trained hand-picked terrorists in the use of chemical and biological weapons. Among this select group was Kamal Borgas, an Algerian al-Qaeda operative who was convicted in British courts in 2004 and 2005 for the murder of a British police officer and also of conspiracy to commit a public nuisance by the use of poisons and/or explosives. The school's director was an Egyptian named Midhat Mursi, better known by his al-Qaeda nom de guerre, Abu Kabab. And among its instructors were at least one Pakistani microbiologist, as well as Yazid Sufat. When U.S. military forces overran the camp in 2001, evidence of the progress achieved in developing chemical weapons as diverse as hydrogen cyanide, chlorine, and phosgene were discovered. Mursi himself was killed in 2008 by a missile fired by a U.S. Predator drone. Mursi's death, of course, dealt a significant blow to al-Qaeda's non-conventional weapons development efforts. But significantly, it did not end them. In fact, as the aforementioned senior U.S. intelligence officer recently commented, al-Qaeda's ongoing procurement efforts have been well established for a while now. They haven't been highlighted in the U.S. media, but that isn't the same as not happening. In 2010, for example, credible intelligence surfaced that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, widely considered the movement's most dangerous and capable affiliate, was deeply involved in the development of ricin, a bioweapon made from castor beans that the FBI has termed the third most deadly toxic substance known, behind only plutonium and botulism. This past May, Turkish authorities seized 2 kilos of sarin nerve gas, the same weapon used in the 1995 attack on the Tokyo Underground, and arrested 12 men linked to al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra. Days later, another set of sarin-related arrests were made in Iraq of al-Qaeda operatives based in that country who were separately overseeing the production of sarin and mustard blistering agents at least 2 secret locations. Finally, just the other day, Israel admitted that for the past 3 years, it has been holding a senior al-Qaeda operative whose expertise is in biological warfare. The revelations over his alleged biological weapons links, one account of the detention noted, come amid concerns that al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria are attempting to procure bioweapons and may already have done so. Indeed, Syria's ongoing civil war, the prominent position of 2 key al-Qaeda affiliates, Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, along with other sympathetic jihadi entities enmeshed in that epic struggle, coupled with the potential access afforded to Bashar Assad's chemical weapons stockpiles, suggests that we have likely not heard the last of al-Qaeda's interests and ambitions to obtain nerve agents, poison gas, and other harmful toxins for use as mass casualty weapons. Let me now shift for the latter half of the presentation or the lecture to the opposite end of the technological spectrum, where we see the simplicity is very much in the sophistication. Nonetheless, a fundamental paradox appears to exist so far as terrorist capabilities involving chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons are concerned. As mesmerizingly attractive as these non-conventional weapons remain to al-Qaeda and perhaps other terrorist organizations, they have also proven mostly frustratingly disappointing to whomever has tried to use them. Despite the extensive use of poison gas during World War I, for instance, this weapon accounted for only 5% of all casualties in that conflict. Even in more recent times, chemical weapons claimed the lives of fewer than 1%, roughly 5,000 persons, of the 600,000 Iranians who died in the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq War. The Japanese cult, Aum Shinrikyo, succeeded in killing no more than a dozen persons in its attack on the Tokyo Underground in 1995. And 5 years earlier, no fatalities resulted from a Tamil Tiger's assault on a Sri Lankan armed forces base in East Kiran, Sri Lanka, that employed chlorine gas. In fact, the wind changed direction and blew the gas into the Tiger's own ranks, thus aborting their attack. The wartime use of biological weapons has a similarly checkered record. On at least 11 occasions before and during World War II, the Imperial Japanese Army employed germ agents as diverse as cholera, dysentery, bubonic plague, anthrax, and paratyphoid, disseminated both in water and in air. Not only did these fail to kill as many Chinese soldiers as the Japanese had hoped, but on at least one occasion, the 1942 assault on Chekiang, 10,000 Japanese soldiers themselves were affected, of whom nearly 2,000 died. The Japanese program's principal defect, a problem to all efforts so far, the American terrorism expert Professor David Rappaport has concluded, was an ineffective delivery system. The difficulties of using germs as weapons is further substantiated by the work of Dr. Seth Karras, a researcher at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Karras has compiled perhaps the most authoritative accounting of the use of biological agents involving a wide range of adversaries, including terrorists, government operatives, ordinary criminals, and the mentally unstable. His exhaustive database reveals that during the entire 20th century, a grand total of 10 people were killed and fewer than 1,000 made ill as a result of a couple of hundred acts of either bioterrorism or biocrimes. The majority of these incidents, moreover, involve the selective poisoning of specific people rather than the wholesale, indiscriminate attacks against civilian populations often imagined. The formidable challenges of obtaining the strategic nuclear material needed to construct a nuclear bomb, along with the fabrication and dissemination difficulties involving the use of noxious gases and biological agents, perhaps account for the operational conservatism long observed in terrorist tactics and weaponry. As politically radical or religiously fanatical as terrorists may be, they nonetheless to date have overwhelmingly seemed to adhere or to prefer the tactical assurance of the comparatively modest efforts achieved by the conventional weapons with which they are familiar, compared with the risk of failure inherent in the use of more exotic means of death and destruction. Terrorists, as Brian Jenkins famously observed in 1985, thus continue to appear to be more imitative than they are innovative. Accordingly, what innovation does occur tends to be more in the realm of the clever adaptation or modification of existing tactics, such as turning hijacked commercial airliners into human cruise missiles, or in the means and methods used to fabricate and detonate explosive devices, than in the use of some new or dramatically novel or different weapon. Terrorists have thus basically functioned in a technological vacuum, either aloof or averse to the profound changes that have fundamentally altered the nature of modern warfare. Whereas technological progress has produced successively more complex, lethally effective, and destructively accurate weapon systems that are deployed from a variety of air, land, sea, and space platforms, terrorists continue to rely, as they have for more than a century, on the same two weapon systems, the gun and the bomb. Admittedly, the guns used by terrorists today have larger ammunition capacities and more rapid rates of fire than the simple revolver the Russian revolutionary Vera Sasulich used in 1878 to assassinate the Governor General of St. Petersburg. Similarly, bombs today require smaller amounts of explosives that are exponentially more powerful and more easily concealed than the sticks of TNT with which the Fenian dynamiters terrorized London more than a century ago. But the fact remains that the vast majority of terrorist incidents continue to utilize these same two attack modes. Why is this? There are perhaps two obvious explanations: ease and cost. Indeed, as Leonardo da Vinci is said to have observed in a completely different era and an entirely different context, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. The same can be said about most terrorists and insurgent weapons and tactics today. Improvised explosive devices and bombs, constructed of commercially available, readily accessible, homemade materials, now account for the lion's share of terrorist and insurgent attacks. The two crude bombs packed in ordinary pressure cookers that killed 3 persons and injured nearly 300 others at last April's Boston Marathon is among the more recent cases in point, as are the succession of peroxide-based bombs that featured in the July 2005 suicide attacks on London transport, the 2006 plot to blow up 7 American and Canadian airliners while in flight from Heathrow to various destinations in North America, and the 2009 attempt to replicate the London transport bombings on New York City's subway system. The account of the construction of the bombs intended for the New York City attack, presented in the recently published book, Enemies Within, vividly illustrates this point. Written by 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, the book describes how the would-be bomber, an Afghanistan-born permanent U.S. resident named Najibullah Zazi, easily purchased the ingredients needed for the device's construction, and then, following the instructions given to him by his al-Qaeda handlers in Pakistan, where he was trained, created a crude but potentially devastatingly lethal weapon. Let me quote briefly from their account. For weeks he'd been visiting, this is Najibullah Zazi they're talking about. For weeks he'd been visiting beauty supply stores, filling his carts with hydrogen peroxide and nail polish remover. At the beauty supply warehouse, among the rows of wigs, braids, and extensions, the manager knew him as Jerry. He said his girlfriend owned hair salons. There was no reason to doubt him. On pharmacy shelves, in the little brown plastic bottles, hydrogen peroxide is a disinfectant, a sting-free way to clean scrapes. Beauty salons use a more concentrated version to bleach hair or activate hair dyes. At even higher concentrations, it burns the skin. It is not flammable on its own, but when it reacts with other chemicals, it quickly releases oxygen, creating an environment ripe for explosions. Even with a cheap stove, it's easy to simmer water out of hydrogen peroxide, leaving behind something more potent. It takes time, and he had plenty of that. Preparing the explosive initiator was only slightly more complicated, but considerably more dangerous. Hence, Zazi had to be especially careful. Again, I'm picking up the narrative from the book. He added the muriatic acid and watched as the chemicals crystallized. The crystals are known as triacetone triperoxide, or TATP. A spark, electrical current, even a bit of friction can set off an explosion. The white crystal compound had been popular among Palestinian terrorists. It was cheap and powerful, but its instability had earned it the nickname Mother of Satan. When he was done mixing, he rinsed the crystals with baking soda and water to make his creation more stable. He placed the finished product in a wide-rimmed glass jar about the size of a coffee tin and inspected his work. There would be enough for 3 detonators. 3 detonators inside 3 backpacks filled with a flammable mixture and ball bearings. The same type of weapon that left 52 persons dead in London in 2005. He was ready for New York. These types of improvised weapons are not only devastatingly effective, but remarkably inexpensive, hence further accounting for their popularity with terrorists and insurgents today. The House of Commons Intelligence and Security Committee, which investigated the 2005 London transport attacks, for instance, concluded that the entire operation cost less than £8,000 to execute. This sum included an overseas trip to Pakistan so that the cell leader and an accomplice could acquire the requisite bomb-making skills at an al-Qaeda facility or training camp in that country's northwest frontier province, the purchase of all the needed equipment and ingredients once they were back in Britain, the rental of an apartment in Leeds that they turned into a bomb factory, the hiring of cars and purchase of cell phones, and other incidentals. The cost-effectiveness of such homemade devices and their appeal to terrorists is, of course, not new. Decades ago, the Provisional Irish Republican Army demonstrated the disproportionate effects and enormous damage that crude, inexpensive, but powerful homemade explosive devices could achieve. In what was described at the time as the most powerful explosion in London since World War II, a pyrofertilizer-based bomb made with urea nitrate and diesel fuel exploded outside the Baltic Exchange in April 1992, killing 3 persons, wounding 90 others, leaving a 12-foot wide crater and causing an estimated $1.25 billion in damages and lost revenue. Exactly a year later, a similar bomb devastated the nearby Bishopsgate, killing 1 person and injuring more than 40 others. Estimates put the damage and economic losses as a result of that blast at $1.5 billion. Long a staple of pyro operations, fertilizer had cost the group in the early 1990s on average 1% of the comparable amount of plastic explosive. Although after adulteration, fertilizer is admittedly less powerful than plastic explosive, for example, the Czech-manufactured military ordnance Semtex that was used to down Pan Am Flight 103 in 1988 explodes at about 8,000 yards a second and has a high explosive rating of 1.3, whereas such improvised explosives using urea nitrate exploded only about 3,000 yards a second and ranged between 0.25 to 0.8 in high explosive rating. However, these improvised explosives tend to cause more damage than plastic explosives because the energy of the blast is more sustained and less controlled. Similarly, the homemade bomb used in the first attack on New York City's World Trade Center in 1993, consisting of urea nitrate derived from fertilizer, but enhanced by 3 canisters of hydrogen gas to create a more powerful fuel-air explosion, produced a similarly impressive return on the terrorist investment. The device cost less than $400 to construct. Yet it not only killed 6 persons, injured more than 1,000 others, and gouged a 180-foot wide crater 6 stories deep beneath the tower, it also caused an estimated $550 million in damages and lost revenues to the businesses housed there. Finally, the Seabourn suicide bomb attack on the USS Cole, a U.S. Navy destroyer anchored in Aden, Yemen 6 years later, reportedly cost al-Qaeda no more than $10,000 to implement. But in addition to claiming the lives of 17 American sailors and wounding 39 others, it cost the U.S. Navy $250 million to repair the damage caused to the vessel. This trend towards the increased use of improvised explosive devices has, of course, had its most consequential and pernicious effects in Iraq and Afghanistan during our 2 countries' prolonged deployments there. As Professor Andrew Bacevich, the retired U.S. Army officer turned Boston University academician, has written, no matter how badly battered and beaten the terrorists on these and other recent battlefields, they were not intimidated, remained unrepentant, and kept coming back for more, devising tactics against which forces, optimized for conventional combat, did not have a ready response. The term invented for this was asymmetric conflict, loosely translated as war against adversaries who don't fight the way we would like them to. In Iraq and Afghanistan, both terrorists and insurgents have waged low-risk wars of attrition against American, British, Allied, and host military forces using a variety of IEDs with triggering devices as simple as garage door openers, cordless phones, and car key fobs to confound, if not hobble, among the most technologically advanced militaries in the history of mankind. The richest, most trained army just got beat by dudes in man jammies and AKs, an American soldier observed to a New York Times reporter after one such bloody engagement in Afghanistan 5 years ago. Indeed, terrorists and insurgents in both that country and Iraq have demonstrated the effectiveness of even poorly or modestly armed non-state adversaries to confront superior conventional military forces and wage a deadly war of attrition designed in part to undermine popular support and resolve back home for these prolonged deployments. Equally worrisome, these battle environments have become spawning grounds for continued and future violence. Real-life training camps for jihadis and hands-on laboratories for the research and development of new and ever more deadly terrorist and insurgent tactics and techniques. How do you stop foes who kill with devices built for the price of a pizza? Was the question posed in a Newsweek magazine cover story about IEDs in 2007. Maybe the question is, it continued, can you stop them? At one point, IEDs were responsible for nearly 2/3 of military fatalities caused by terrorists and insurgents in Iraq, and 1/4 of the military fatalities in Afghanistan. According to one account, there was an IED incident every 15 minutes in Iraq during 2006. And after the number of IED attacks had doubled in Afghanistan during 2009, this tactic accounted for 3/4 of military casualties in some regions. These explosive devices were often constructed using either scavenged artillery or mortar shells, with military or commercial ordnance, or from entirely homemade ingredients. They were then buried beneath roadways, concealed among roadside refuse, hidden in animal carcasses or behind telephone poles, camouflaged into curbsides, or secreted along the guardrails on the shoulders of roadways. They were put in boxes or disguised as ordinary roads or bricks strewn by the side of the road. As military vehicle armor improved, the bomb makers adapted and adjusted to these new force protection measures and began to design and emplace IEDs in elevated positions, attaching them high on road signs or to trees in order to impact the vehicle's unarmored upper structures. The method of detonation has also varied as U.S., allied, and host forces adopted to insurgent and terrorist tactics. Command wire detonators were replaced by radio signal triggering devices, such as cell phones and garage door openers. These devices were remote wired up to 100 meters from the IED detonator to obviate jamming measures and other countermeasures. More recently, infrared lasers have been used as explosive initiators. One or more 155 millimeter artillery shell are rigged with blasting caps and improvised shrapnel, packed with bits of concrete, nuts, bolts, screws, tacks, and ball bearings, and have been positioned alongside roads, often arrayed in daisy chain explosions designed to mow down quick reaction forces converging on the scene following the initial blast and the first wave of casualties. By 2011, the U.S. Defense Department had spent nearly $20 billion on IED countermeasures alone, including new technologies, programs, and enhanced and constantly updated training. A massive new military bureaucracy had to be created to oversee this effort, and itself was charged with creating unconventional processes for introducing new programs. Yet, as the British Army found in its war against Jewish terrorists in Palestine 70 years ago, there is no easy or lasting solution to this threat. ID attacks had in fact become so pervasive in Palestine after World War II that in December 1946, British Army headquarters in Jerusalem had issued a meticulously detailed 35-page pamphlet complete with photographs and diagrams describing these weapons, their ingenious emplacement, and their lethal effectiveness. Even so, as military commanders and civilian authorities alike acknowledged at the time, IDs were then, as now, virtually impossible to completely defend against. Perhaps the most novel and innovative use of IDs, however, has been when they have been paired with toxic chemicals. Much as the Iraq conflict has served as a proving ground for other terrorist weapons and tactics, it has also served this purpose with chemical weapons. Between 2007 and 2010, more than a dozen major truck bomb attacks occurred in Iraq involving conventional weapons paired with chlorine gas. The most serious incident, however, was one that was foiled by Jordanian authorities in April 2004. It involved the toxic release of chemicals into a crowded urban environment and was orchestrated by the late Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the founder and leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. The Amman plot entailed the use of some 20 tons of chemicals and explosives to target simultaneously the Prime Minister's office, the General Intelligence Department's headquarters, and the U.S. Embassy. Although the main purpose of the coordinated operation were forced entry attacks by suicide bombers against these three heavily protected, high-value targets, an ancillary intention is believed to have been the infliction of mass casualties to the surrounding areas by the noxious chemicals deliberately released by the blasts. An estimated 80,000 people, Jordanian authorities claim, would have been killed or seriously injured had the operation succeeded. The above attacks in Iraq and the foiled incident in Amman all underscore the potential for terrorists to attack a domestic industrial chemical facility with a truck bomb or other large explosive device, where the purpose would be designed to trigger the release of toxic chemicals. In this respect, the effects of prior industrial accidents involving chemicals may exert a profound influence or attraction to terrorists. In 2005, for example, a train crash and derailment in South Carolina released some 60 tons of liquefied chlorine into the air, killing 9 persons and injuring 250 others. Considerably more tragic, of course, was the 1984 disaster at the Union Carbide chemical facility in Bhopal, India. Some 40 tons of methyl isocyanate were accidentally released into the environment that killed nearly 4,000 persons living around the plant. Methyl isocyanate is one of the more toxic chemicals used in industry, with a toxicity that is only a few % less than that of sarin. Okay, let me very briefly conclude. The war on terrorism nowadays excites little interest and still less enthusiasm. A decade of prolonged military deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan have drained both the treasuries and willpower of the United States, Great Britain, and many other countries of the ardor and commitment that attended the commencement of this global struggle over a dozen years ago. The killings of leading al-Qaeda figures such as Osama bin Laden and Anwar al-Awlaki, in addition to some 40 other senior al-Qaeda commanders and hundreds of its fighters, has sufficiently diminished the threat of terrorism to our war-wearied, economically preoccupied nations. Indeed, the famed British Foreign Office Mandarin, Sir Robert Vansittart, could have been referring to 2013 when he observed of the interwar period 80 years ago. Left or right, everybody was for a quiet life. But before we exhale a collective sigh of relief that the threat from either al-Qaeda or terrorism has passed, it would be prudent to pause and reflect on the expansive dimensions of al-Qaeda's WMD research and development efforts described in this lecture, and to consider as well the continuing developments on the opposite end of the terrorism technological spectrum that have likewise transformed the threat against superior militaries and even against reigning superpowers. Like it or not, the war on terrorism continues, abetted by the technological advances of our adversaries and thus far mercifully countered by our own technological prowess, but all the more so by our continued unyielding vigilance. Thank you very much.
So Bruce has agreed to answer a few questions.
Do you think the leading, what I call leading al-Qaeda groups, will they be influencing non-Islamic jihadi groups as well? People that maybe just want a part of Syria for a non-religious entity?
I'm sorry, could you, I didn't
Well,
quite hear.
going back to the Syrian question,
Yes.
the leading al-Qaeda groups, they're the ones that have been focused on by Assad and US, etc.
Right.
Do you think they will influence non-Islamic, i.e. secular groups who are just interested in a bit of land and oil?
That's a very good question. I think, unfortunately, at the moment, for the foreseeable future, the jihadi groups are in ascendance, even though there's often an intense rivalry between Jabhat al-Nusra and the ISIS. But they have, firstly, I think, proven the most effective in fighting against the Assad forces. But what worries me more is that they have at least laid the groundwork for facilitating their dream of carving out a territory that they can rule and govern, that they can impose their interpretation of Sharia. And what worries me the most, oddly enough, isn't their kinetic abilities or their warfighting capabilities. I mean, that goes hand in glove with terrorists and guerrillas everywhere. It's much more complicated, of course, in Syria because of, I just read a UN report that said there's at least 5,000 different militias fighting Assad there. But what worries me the most is that these two al-Qaeda entities, as a child, I never believed that a leopard could change its spots. And al-Qaeda in the past was, fortunately for us, its own worst enemy, and its activities in Iraq was a classic example of that. But what I find so worrisome is that, firstly, in some circles, Jabhat al-Nusra is being seen as a more moderate force than the ISIS, than the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham or the Levant. And secondly, that both groups are doing what al-Qaeda never did in the past, again, to our benefit. They're engaging in social welfare activities. They're running schools, they're running clinics, they're providing people with jobs and food. I mean, they're borrowing a leaf from Hamas or Hezbollah or the PLO many years ago, and therefore not defining themselves as solely terrorist groups, but venturing into a realm that al-Qaeda was either too clumsy or too stupid to get involved in the past. And that to me is worrisome because, unfortunately, with those sorts of services, I mean, ice cream contests, al-Qaeda sponsoring ice cream contests, tug of wars between Jabhat al-Nusra and the ISIS, I mean, like sort of village fairs. I mean, that to me is the most worrisome thing is, unfortunately, they're getting smarter. And even if they haven't quite changed their spots, they've changed their appearance, and they're deliberately, I think, trying to cultivate or develop a constituency in Syria to an extent that they really had failed everywhere else. I think, it's a very good question, a much more complex question. I think the fundamental problem, honestly, I may not look it, but I've been studying terrorism for nearly 4 decades, since I first was a graduate student in 1976. The one thing that's remained constant is terrorists always learn and always seek to capitalize on either the mistakes that they make or the mistakes of other groups. Governments themselves, I think, veer from one extreme to another. The extreme, as we saw in America with the Patriot Act, various other measures right after 9/11, to one now that's, I think, much less certain, where people are doubting many of those measures, but also this, I think, the very strong desire to say that the war on terrorism's over, Bin Laden's dead, the threat is past. I agree completely. Bin Laden is dead, that we know. The threat has passed from that al-Qaeda, but the problem is we're talking about a dynamic evolutionary force, and that's what terrorism is. If terrorists don't evolve, if they're not dynamic, if they don't adapt and adjust to the countermeasures we put in their place, they don't succeed, they don't terrorize anyone. So as long as they're going to remain committed to their cause, they have to be about change and evolution. And sometimes I think always in the West we're cast in a reactive mode. After unfortunately we're presented with a tragedy, we respond, sometimes overreact, but don't realize that this is part of, I would argue, an operational continuum of warfare that has really, unfortunately, become enmeshed in the 21st century to an extent greater than in the past. And part of the reason is, again, the ease and cost effectiveness that non-state actors can bring against established nation states.
I wonder if you'd comment on issues which obviously have perplexed a lot of us for a long time. Firstly, why do you think we were so slow? By I say we, I link the UK with the United States, but also DOD and the CIA, so slow in predicting the savagery of the insurgency that hit us in 2003, 2004, the delayed realization of what was going to come at us. And the second part of that, moving forward, I mean, after 4 years of blood and effort, it did seem to me that at last Al-Qaeda had more or less been finished. In your lecture, I noticed a sort of absence of key dates when we got to 2007, 2008, 2009. But they're back again now. And, I mean, would you go as far as to say that we had more or less finished them off as an active force, but Syria has given them a new lease of life?
Well, I'll answer the second one first. And let me back up a bit. I mean, we finished them off. That's, I think, what frustrates me. I think we finished them off many times in the past. We finished them off in 2001 and 2002, and then, unfortunately, we were diverted to Iraq. And this is when Afghanistan, because of our preoccupation, once again emerged as a problem. I think that we nearly had finished them off in Iraq. That, you know, we can rewrite history, but whether it was the Anbar Awakening and the Sons of Iraq, or whether it was General Petraeus and the counterinsurgency doctrine, and probably counterinsurgency is a worse epithet to use in Washington than even WMD is here. You know, nonetheless, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated. One just has to look at the newspaper. I mean, there's a whole series of very consequential suicide car and bomb attacks, which is not at all unusual in Iraq just this past weekend. Unfortunately, Al-Qaeda in Iraq not only revived when we took our eyes off the situation, or when our resources and attention was diverted away from Iraq, it not only revived itself, but created Syria. I mean, Al-Qaeda's insertion in Syria is the direct responsibility of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and its success is evident in the fact that it spawned rival groups that are contending with it for who will govern, who will rule or run Syria. So I think, you know, we certainly had finished them off, and they're back now. This would be a completely different lecture, and probably one that I would have used PowerPoint for. But one of the things that's concerned me the most in recent years, and some people in this room have even seen this lecture, is that since 2008, Al-Qaeda has achieved the unimaginable, at least in my view. Al-Qaeda has actually grown and increased while the rest of the world's economies, government bureaucracies, militaries are shrinking. Well, we're, you know, laying off people, part-time British soldiers, and 30,000 part-time British soldiers are expected to do what 20,000 full-time would do. It's no different than the United States. Al-Qaeda's grown. In 2008, it had perhaps 7 or 8 theaters of operation around the globe. It's more than doubled that in the past few years. And these are the problems in North Africa and West Africa, the expansion in East Africa. And unfortunately, what they've been able to do is take advantage of the sanctuaries and safe havens that they've been able to gain in states that have either undergone profound political and economic upheaval, or else states that have just been weakened by uprisings or by serial years of violence. And the same way that 30 years ago, Prime Minister Thatcher said that publicity is the oxygen terrorists breathe. For Al-Qaeda, access to sanctuary and safe havens, the oxygen that they thrive on. And that's why Syria is so critical, because there are parts of Syria that these groups now control. And that's what worries me, is that they will use these places as bases. One, I mean, as pessimistic as I am about many things in life, another September 11th attack, one hopes, is beyond the realm of the current Al-Qaeda. Although on September 10th, 2001, I would have told you I thought that was beyond that Al-Qaeda as well. But the point is, though, I think their capability to operate on a global canvas, given their expansion, in essence, to many different zones of conflict. 18 months ago, I would have just talked about Al-Qaeda in Nigeria, but they're in Nigeria, Mauritania, Niger, Mali as well. means, again, that the war, it's a different war on terrorism, but it still continues. And unfortunately, I think what also worries me the most is when I first started studying terrorism in the 1980s at the RAND Corporation, we did a big study for a US government agency. And I thought this was rather surprising, but not atypical. The most common vocation of terrorists in the 1970s and 1980s were either school teachers, university professors, and they were in either philosophy or political science departments, or perhaps medical doctors. I mean, we still see medical doctors are popular. Ayman al-Zawahiri is a doctor. What's so worrisome now is that at least recent reports, unclassified, that I've been reading from Pakistan, Al-Qaeda is not recruiting sort of the stereotypical warrior hill tribesmen that come down from the hills with, shalwar kameez and bandoliers of bullets and AK-47s. They're recruiting well-educated, middle-class Pakistani youths that come, of course, from that country's university's most prestigious faculties, engineering and the sciences. And that, I think, does have the potential to change terrorism to an extent that we haven't seen it when there were people like myself, historians or political scientists or philosophers. And your first question about didn't anyone see the insurgency coming in 2003 and 2004? I was in Baghdad then. I was an advisor. Wishful thinking was the order of the day. I mean, the vice president at the time, the secretary of defense at the time, outlawed the word insurgent. These were, as we heard on the media, dead-enders or thugs. There was a complete dismissiveness of the threat. I remember when I arrived in Baghdad in 2003, I was at all these meetings, and I thought, this is really odd. No one's talking about the sort of canonical counter-terrorists or counterterrorism or counterinsurgency measures that had been used in Northern Ireland, for example, and in other places for many years. And I first thought, well, I guess they tried them all and they just didn't work and they're moving on. It was only after I was there for a while I realized that basically any discussion of that had been banned. So it was really only when the situation deteriorated, and I was there when it really deteriorated so badly in 2004 that we finally recognized what was happening. And then there was the obvious point. You cashier an entire army or an entire class of people and you put them out in the street. They have no way to support their families. They're going to turn to whatever sources. And a lot of the insurgency was driven by economics then. I mean, the people that we were interrogating would admit that.
I think we'll take any other questions in a slightly more relaxed atmosphere. So what I'd like to do now is call upon our President and Rector, Sakitha Nyans, to move a formal vote of thanks. And then we'll invite you all to join us for a drink just immediately opposite this lecture room. Keith.
I haven't got a microphone, so I hope you can hear me. Bruce, on behalf of all of us here, can we thank you for what has been quite an exceptional lecture, and I think we just had us all really quite transfixed. I mean, you've taken us through the 90s, the 2000s, on an extraordinary journey of fact and exposing the events, reminding us of many of the gruesome ones from which your initial thesis about technology use emerges rather elegantly. Looking around the audience here, I see quite a large number of people who in one role or another spent quite a lot of their lives during this period dealing with these problems, thinking about them, putting policies into place, building the bridges with the United States, and so on. I think all of us here, Bruce, will rest on your final words and note, and you point out, that geographically the threat has spread. Probably per unit area, it's weakened. Some of the principal drivers are still there, and we must never be complacent as to what lies ahead. Bruce, that was absolutely terrific. Can I thank everybody here to thank Bruce for an extraordinary lecture, and without PowerPoints. That's also quite extraordinary here. Thank you.
Thank you.